This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Ryan O'Farrell. He's an independent researcher focusing mostly on the Congo. He's going to be telling us about how the wars in Congo that you never see in the news are splintering and turning into many different wars at the same time. You've got different tribesmen fighting other tribesmen, farmers fighting farmers. There's even an ISIS-affiliated cell now in the Congo, hiding out in the jungles. So Ryan's going to explain all that for us and tell us why Congo is really a place people should be focusing on, rather than just thinking, oh, you know, war happens there, that's it. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. That is patreon.com/popularfront. Every little bit helps. There are premium episodes, all sorts there for a very little price, and it helps us keep going. It's quite hard to explain in a nutshell what's going on in the Congo, but it's a place you never ever see in the news. And right now, what was, a few conflicts has kind of splintered into dozens of different ones. Maybe you can give us, a brief overview of what is going on right now in the Congo.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the splintering thing is probably the most salient point. Congo doesn't have one war. It's got 10 or 20 or dozens even. So that all kind of kicked off in the 1990s with the Rwandan genocide. Basically, over 1 million refugees kind of went into Congo after the RPF took over in Rwanda. So the RPF is the Rwandan Patriotic Front. So it's kind of the Tutsi-dominated, what was a rebel movement in the early 90s. So they fought a civil war against the Hutu-dominated government in Rwanda from 90 to 93.
The Tutsis and the Hutus, they're just different tribes, right?
Yeah, so the Tutsi are about 15% of the population in Rwanda. The Hutu are about 85%. Tutsi were kind of traditionally the aristocracy. But when the Belgians came in, they kind of put a much more legalistic definition to that, and it really kind of solidified a lot of kind of interethnic tensions. So then upon independence, that kind of switched. There was the Hutu revolution in 59, and so a lot of Tutsi were driven out of the country, and there was a Hutu republic was declared. So there's a lot of Tutsi who are not very happy with the new regime that came in, and kind of organized rebel movements. And finally, in 1990, they invaded from Uganda. So there was a civil war then from 90 to 93, a peace accord, and then in 94, the Hutu president, Habyarimana, his airplane was shot down, and that really kicked off the genocide. From there, the civil war obviously kind of immediately restarted as soon as Tutsi were being massacred. But the Tutsi rebels actually then won the civil war and defeated the genocidaires, the Rwandan army, as well as kind of these affiliated extremist militias. And when they won, basically the genocidaires and 1 million to 1.5 million Hutu then fled out of Rwanda into Congo, which totally destabilized the whole situation in Congo. And that kind of persisted for another 2 years. The army and the Hutu extremist militias were controlling these massive refugee camps in eastern Congo. They took all their weapons with them. They took the entire Rwandan treasury with them, and were using that as bases to launch raids back into Rwanda. So obviously the new government in Rwanda is none too pleased about that. So then in October 1996, so 2 years later, 2 and a bit, they invaded Congo, and that's kind of what started off this whole catastrophe.
Right, so all that happened. There was, as we know, there's big conflicts when the wars were really kicking off, when they invaded, as you said. But now, ostensibly that is kind of finished, but it's not. And I was reading the other day, there are farmers fighting other farmers, there are farmers fighting tribesmen, there are, Islamist militias, there's all sorts going on. Maybe you can talk about the current situation.
Basically, those invasions and the wars that kind of came after them totally splintered the security situation. So dozens of these militia groups popped up. Some of them are foreign groups, like Rwandan groups, Ugandan groups. There's Burundian rebels as well. Tons of Congolese ethnic militias that kind of pop up to protect their little areas, go after mineral mining, other things like that. So I think right now it's between 120 and 140 different rebel groups in these 5 provinces in the east. And so there was a peace deal in 2002, so things kind of tapered off a bit, but it's always simmered on since then, and a lot of the proliferation of weapons that came in that period have made it really, really easy for people to take to arms, and the state is quite weak in the east. So it's very easy for people to try to settle the differences with violence.
Right, and which are the main groups fighting now? I read that there was something like 1 million people displaced last year or the year before due to just inter-militia fighting here, there. Who are the people causing the real problems right now?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say there's probably 6 main hotspots in the east. There's in Ituri, which is kind of the northernmost of these areas. You've got intra-ethnic fighting between the Lendu and the Hima. So the Lendu are traditionally the farmers, and Hima traditionally cattle herders. The Hima were very much favored by the Belgians, so they're a little wealthier, more access to education. And then when the Ugandans invaded during the war in 1999, they put a Hima as governor of Ituri, which kicked off a really nasty kind of war within a war that lasted until 2007. So in 2007, FARDC, which is the National Army, and MONUSCO, which are the UN peacekeepers, deployed in force and really kind of tempered things down. But that kicked off again in December 2017. So it kind of the 6 months after that, up until summer of last year, it basically kind of devolved into an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Hima. So about 350,000 people were displaced. Maybe 40,000 fled to Uganda. So FARDC deployed again last summer and tempered it a little bit, but then in September it kicked off again. And the allegations are that these Lendu militias kind of got orders from on high to destabilize the situation again in the run-up to the election, which was in December. How true that is kind of debatable. I mean, rumors are as they are. Kind of going south from there to like the next hotspot would be the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces. So this one is in the news a lot. This is the new Islamic State Central Africa province. So this is a Ugandan group that tried to stage a revolt in Uganda in the early 90s, just got pretty resoundingly defeated and fled across the border into Congo, and has been there ever since. So they've been there for a couple decades now. They kind of integrated themselves into the war in Congo, and for a little while they were using the territory to stage raids back into Uganda again, but Uganda's got a pretty competent military and defeated them by like 1999 or so. So they've been kind of limping along ever since, but in 2010, FARDC launched an offensive against them to crack down, and they basically responded by carrying out reprisal attacks on Congolese civilians, which they hadn't really done before that too much. They tried to keep into the good graces of the locals.
When you say retaliation attacks, I've read a little bit about them. They're basically just going into villages and just killing everybody, right?
Yes, exactly.
Incredibly brutal.
Oh, horrible. So 2010, it kind of started with mass kidnappings. And then in 2014, as the FARDC's kind of military pressure ramped up, they just went straight to massacres. So since then, they've probably killed somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people. Pretty consistently, but also attacking military positions. That's probably the hottest zone of insurgency in the east right now.
Well, I keep seeing, ISIS is in the Congo now. So basically, for a while I was like, bullshit. No, they're not. But then it seems now they've, pledged allegiance, or what's the situation with the ADF and this kind of ISIS link?
Yeah, so they are Islamists, and they always have been. But they were a little lighter. They weren't quite, ISIS Islamists. That definitely took a turn as the military pressure stepped up. Um, so they started adopting more of kind of your traditional Salafi jihadist language, talking about the infidels and who was Muslim and who was not. Um, and I think a big part of that is as they were kind of struggling and looking for their identity in the region. And this is a foreign group. They have some difficulty recruiting Congolese. And Congo's Muslim population is tiny. I mean, it's 2% or something. So they kind of needed to attach themselves to a broader brand, in the hopes of attracting finance from abroad, as well as foreign fighters. So their main leader, Jamil Makulu, was arrested in 2015, and he had a British passport and was getting money donated from Muslim associations in the UK. And so when he was arrested, that kind of financial tap closed off.
How the fuck did he have these connections all the way in the UK, and he's running this Islamist group in the Congo? That's a mad story.
Yeah, he got around quite a bit. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. So I'm not exactly how he got the passport, but he was definitely in and out of the UK quite a few times. This guy's jumping back and forth from the middle of nowhere in Congo to the UK. So basically since then, I think they've really tried to solidify their identity more in kind of the global international jihadist brand, ISIS being the most salient one. So they started adopting some of the motifs. They changed their name to the city of monotheists and holy warriors. They adopted the flag.
Catchy.
Oh yeah. So I'd say probably the biggest actual connection though is a guy was arrested in Kenya who was moving money to them. So it wasn't a huge amount. The indictment said $150,000 for multiple ISIS affiliates around the continent. So how much actually got to the ADF in Uganda in Congo is somewhat debatable, but those ties are definitely there. Baghdadi recognized them. It was in that video he came out with recently. It was one of his little binder booklets.
These guys are now officially ISIS in where exactly? Not just the Congo.
Well, they call them Central Africa Province, but yeah, I mean they're really only operating in Beni territory in North Kivu in Congo.
Okay. Where are they? What obviously they must have some kind of training camp. Where are they? Are they in the jungles? What's going on?
Yeah, so there's a kind of a national forest called Simuliki Forest that's very close to the Ugandan border. So they do recruit a lot of people in Uganda. That's probably the majority of their fighters are actually Ugandans. But yeah, it's pretty rough terrain out in the jungle. They've got some training camps, and it's very easy for them to move around in those camps and kind of and through that forest and emerge onto the villages that are clustered along the major roads. And MONUSCO and the FARDC have had a hell of a time trying to track them down and actually defeat them. They've suffered some pretty serious casualties in ambushes against these guys.
As ISIS Central Africa, what kind of attacks have they carried out?
They haven't really been particularly different than the kind of attacks they were carrying out before. So emerging from the jungle, attacking villages, killing people, abducting people, stealing cattle, attacking military positions, ambushes on FARDC and MONUSCO. So that's the style of attacks haven't really changed since they pledged allegiance to ISIS or anything. It's kind of what they've been doing since 2014.
Right, and what is their goal? I mean, kind of disjointed ISIS group in the Congo, in the jungles. It just seems to me like just another franchise, if you like. Do you think they actually pose a threat? I mean, there are so many conflicts going on in the Congo, as you've said.
Oh, people definitely do now. I mean,
Right.
Thousands have been killed, tens of thousands have been displaced. It's very serious.
So they're just going about killing people. That's basically their MO. They're just going about and murdering people because, I don't know, jihad.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like there isn't a rationale to it. It's kind of hard to see what they want their ultimate objectives to be. because the idea that they're going to carve out some emirate in the jungle when they have 400 fighters, 400 to 500 fighters, and they're kind of bringing their families along with them when they carry out raids on villages. So I mean, these guys are really roughing it. So it's kind of hard to see what they think their end goal would be. But when it comes to pledging allegiance to Islamic State, I don't think it was with some grand plan. It was kind of, we need resources, and ISIS needs to look like it's expanding because they're on the ropes as well.
Right. So, for ISIS, it's handy for them, and then for the, their previous group, it's handy for them as well because they get this kind of connection.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a big thing for them is foreign fighters as well. If they can kind of adopt that brand that's got a lot more traction internationally, I think their hope is that they can kind of get more people.
Sure. I want to talk about the military because obviously they're up against a lot here. Like you said, you've got several different militias battling each other in the east. You've got, this now ISIS branch in the jungles. How well equipped are they, and how are they doing in terms of, fighting these various conflicts?
It varies a lot. So the FARDC was created after the war as kind of an amalgamation of the National Army and a variety of rebel groups. So it's been kind of a long process of integrating into a command structure that's more stable and actionable. So they had, on multiple occasions, there were rebel units that formally became part of the FARDC and then mutinied and kind of kicked off new wars. There was a big one in 2006, 2007, which was a Rwandan-backed unit, rebelled, and was the biggest major flare-up of violence since the war ended. And then that happened again in 2013 with the M23. So it's...
What's the M23?
It's another Rwandan-backed group. They were basically angry that parts of the peace deal with the group that mutinied in 2007 weren't implemented. And so they mutinied again and took over a huge chunk along the Rwandan border, including Goma, which is the biggest city in the area. So they were beaten back and defeated. The United States got quite angry with Rwanda and told them to back off and stop helping this group. And so the group was pretty, it was defeated. But it was a pretty serious war. I'd say what's kind of most interesting about that is that it actually kind of provoked the UN Security Council to adjust the mandate for the peacekeepers. So they got the Force Intervention Brigade, which is like a heavy offensive unit of peacekeepers with artillery and attack helicopters and all the rest to really take it to the militias, which peacekeepers usually don't do. And so the FIB and MONUSCO have been there ever since, obviously, but it's the FARDC and the government, it's kind of messy. Their relationships with armed groups vary, and how they deal with different armed groups is quite different. So sometimes they're allies, sometimes they're enemies. Oftentimes it changes. There can be a lot of corrupt deals over things like mineral extraction or timber and other things like that. So that affects a lot about how the army will actually go out and deal with rebel groups.
It sounds like such a mess, you know what I mean? But, you mentioned mineral extraction there. Maybe we should speak about that because, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The Congo is fucked, but it's not really, the West has had a lot to do with that. Like you said, mineral extraction. Well, it's one of the most mineral dense places on earth, right? Yeah, it's one of the poorest. Maybe we should speak about that. Why have so many people from the outside kind of gone into the Congo and done this, that, and the other to make it the way it is?
Yeah, so on the mineral part, I mean, Congo is one of the wealthiest countries on earth. I think one of the estimates I've seen is $25 trillion worth of stuff in the ground.
Wow.
And that's, just what they've estimated now. I think being in an active war zone for the last 20 years, there hasn't been as much exploration as there would otherwise be. So the issue of conflict minerals has settled down a little bit more recently. It was a massive factor during the wars. especially coltan, which is a tin ore that's used in cell phones and electronics.
Yeah, they use it for the screen, right?
Yeah, I believe so, or maybe the battery. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, it's funny when you see these kind of hyper anti-imperialists with iPhones. It's like, well, your screen was probably made by some kid getting whipped in a mine somewhere in the Congo.
Yeah, and so I mean that got quite a bit of international attention. Obviously, no one wants to be walking around with blood minerals in their pocket. There has been quite a fair bit of progress on that. The Dodd-Frank Act, the Financial Regulation Act in the U.S. in 2011, actually had a clause in there requiring American manufacturers to certify where their minerals were coming from, which sounds good, but the kind of backlash on it is that it's really, really hard to do that in Congo. So a lot of times these companies were just not buying from Congo, which then the economy collapses, which is not good from a conflict perspective. And then there's also kind of civil pressure on a lot of companies like Apple to certify that sort of thing. People don't, Apple doesn't want to be associated with that from a reputation perspective.
I read about this years ago, and it's actually also quite easy for Apple to get around it. For example, they can say, well, hey, we bought this coltan from this broker over there, and he said it didn't come from there, so therefore we're good. You know what I mean? The laws are very flimsy in terms of how they can get around it, or it was at the time I read about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's definitely been kind of a thing in progress. For the most part, what I've read, it's become less of an issue. Those kind of industrial minerals. So a lot of groups now are more focusing on illegal gold mining. Gold's just much easier to smuggle, much easier to hide what it is and where it comes from. And so a lot of that gets smuggled out to Uganda, which interestingly, Uganda doesn't really have huge gold reserves, but is exporting large amounts of gold, which kind of sets off some red flags.
Yeah, funny that. Yeah, where did that come from?
There's actually a big gold smelter that's like directly down the street from the airport in Entebbe, outside Kampala. So it's nice for exporting it. So yeah, I'd say gold is probably the biggest commodity in terms of conflict minerals now, and a lot of groups depend on that as their main source of revenue, and fight over it accordingly.
So are a lot of the militias fighting over control of land, not because they have a particular political scenario, but because the gold is over there and we need to take control of it when it's illegally being mined? Is that what it is?
Yeah, in a lot of cases. I mean, it's definitely not every single thing. I mean, with 140 rebel groups, you don't want to paint it with broad brushes. But for a lot of the big ones, yes. So there's one group, the Nduma Defense of the Congo Renove, NDCR. So they're probably one of the strongest groups in Congo now. They're maybe 1,200 fighters, very well organized, got very good relations with the National Army. They mostly fight over gold mines, and they make a lot of money from it. I think one of the UN reports put it at $140,000 a month, which goes a long way in Congo.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So it's been kind of convenient for the military because they're fighting for these mining areas is kind of where they've been focusing, but a lot of the people they're fighting are the FDLR, who are kind of the remnants of the Rwandan Hutu militias that carried out the genocide. I mean, it's 20 years ago. Most of the fighters in those groups now are kind of born after the genocide, but that's where those groups came from. And the military also fights that group. So the military and the NDCR have a quite good relationship and have done joint patrols. And a lot of the NDCR fighters have FARDC uniforms, that sort of thing.
So not all the militias are a threat to the state as such.
No, definitely not. I mean, I kind of hesitant to put a number on it, but a huge number of them kind of act as auxiliaries of the state or auxiliaries of traditional kind of customary chiefs. The state's quite weak. There's not police in a lot of these outlying villages and areas like that. So these groups that are called rebels are in oftentimes kind of the security forces for the traditional authorities that actually rule in those areas.
Right, I mean, they're rebels in the sense that they're kind of rebellious and they're malicious and they're not attached to the government, but they're not actually rebelling against the government.
Yes. But obviously that's pretty flexible and changes, and sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. It kind of depends on local circumstances and local politics and kind of what's going on in the country.
Wow.
So it's pretty messy, and it gets, I think one of the good euphemisms I've heard is these onion layers. So you've got, layers of all of these conflicts from, down at an incredibly local level to more regional level to national level politics to international politics, and all these layers then impact one another and change how all these different actors at all these different levels kind of gauge their situation and react accordingly. So it's very complicated because what one local militia in a village or a town is doing might be steered by, national policy in Rwanda or something, or in Kinshasa, which is 1,000 miles away. But then what happens in those areas may in turn kind of change how those national governments behave as well.
Jesus Christ. So how is the Congo split up? What is it, split up into districts or counties, whatever? How does the government even try to keep control of the whole country?
So there's 26 provinces, I believe. So there's, provincial governments, districts, territories, and kind of who resides in those positions is pretty sought after. I mean, obviously those positions of power come with oftentimes a lot of wealth. So that's oftentimes a huge factor in when conflict breaks out, is competitions over those, the governorship or members of parliament or things like that. So security is primarily done by the FARDC. But I've talked about it's obviously pretty messy. But I think probably important to say that the FARDC has come along quite a bit. So I've looked at some of the surveys, and 10 years ago the army was the least trusted security institution in the East. That if you were to ask civilians, who do you fear the most, it was the army.
Why is that?
Because they were carrying out a lot of the same abuses that a lot of the rebel groups are infamous for. Right. Looting villages, killing people, a lot of sexual violence. That has kind of gradually over the last 10 years changed. So now the army is not, it's not like people love it and trust it with everything, but its reputation has definitely improved, and the reputation of rebel groups has often gone down. And so it's kind of this low simmer off of rebel activity as people put a little more trust in the state.
Right. Is there any one thing then, with that in mind, that unifies the Congolese?
Very, very proud national identity. I mean, that's for sure. Absolutely. And very active politics. It's not just rebels and guys with guns and everything else. They had this election in 2018, in December 2018, that was postponed for 2 years. And, some of these towns are, places like Beni in the east. Beni is kind of infamous for the Allied Democratic Forces attacking it and massacres, and the Ebola outbreak has happened in the same area. But at the same time with this election, there were massive election rallies in these areas. People very engaged with national level politics. It's definitely not a situation where people are totally disengaged from what's happening at a national level just because it's far away. So yeah, that sense of identity is very much there and very powerful.
Okay. Well, with that in mind then, is there any specific, I don't know, armed group that is kind of a nationalist armed group that's saying, yeah, we're going to take over and we want to, rule the country better? Because you would think that, in that context, that there would be at least one of them going, you know what, let's not fight over the gold mines as much and let's try and fix things.
Some have definitely kind of talked about that, but none are really powerful enough in a way where they could even pretend to try to pull that off. So there was one group, the Mai Mai Yakatumba. They're in South Kivu, so a little south of the other areas we were talking about. Um, they really kind of remobilized after 2016. So for a little bit of context, there was supposed to be a presidential election in 2016. And the president, Joseph Kabila, was supposed to step down. He ran out of term limits. There was supposed to be a new election, and they just didn't have that. So for 2 years, it was a constitutional crisis. And so this my group, Yakatumba, that was kind of their main calling card is, we're fighting the illegitimate Kabila regime. They also kind of put it in the context of Kabila being, a stooge of the Rwandans. And so they framed it as not only fighting the illegitimate national government, but that national government is a puppet of foreign powers, so we're also fighting for the sovereignty of Congo. So they got, fairly substantial, took over a pretty wide swath of territory, and were implementing, their own state-like structures. I mean, they were doing passport control at the border and taxes. They had a little navy, which they launched a naval attack on a town on the lakeside, and then
They launched a naval attack with what? Like, what kind of boat?
they just had speedboats with machine guns on them.
Oh shit, man.
Yeah, and then the MONUSCO, the UN peacekeepers, got mobilized and used their attack helicopters and wiped them all out almost immediately. So yeah, that kind of went south. So they got beaten back pretty hard. The military launched a pretty wide offensive on them, and I think at their peak there were like 1,500 combatants, and now it's like 200 or something, and they're kind of on the run in the jungle.
Right.
So there's definitely groups that like appeal to these ideas, but none of them are strong enough or have enough of a national scope to be able to like pull off some sort of national rebellion. Like these are all very local groups mobilizing on a very local basis, usually around specific ethnic groups.
Right. It sounds to me like the militia situation is so scrambled and splintered that it's almost just gangs, really. Like they control this and they control that, but no one can really rise up as such.
Yeah, I mean, definitely for a lot of them, they're more bandits than anything. But some of them are these little armies, and they're well organized and they're well equipped. But I think also that the security forces are pretty good at co-opting groups that really, really pose a threat. Steering them towards rival groups that the military would like to deal with, or otherwise kind of accommodating them into a structure where they don't really pose a threat to the state. There's been a long history of that in the East as well.
Right. I mean, that's the typical kind of tactic anywhere, right? Like make them fight each other so they leave us alone.
Yeah, and if you can steer this rebel movement towards someone else, you can kind of use them as an auxiliary, and they'll be perfectly happy to fight for you or fight alongside you.
Of course. And you said they're well equipped. Where is everybody getting all these weapons from? To be honest, I'm quite ignorant on where weapons come from in Africa as a whole. Why is it that everyone seems to be able to start a militia?
Well, I mean, the war in Congo from 96 to 2003 roughly was huge. I mean, this was the deadliest war since World War II. Had 9 African armies in Congo at one point or another. Dozens of these militia groups. So just the proliferation of weapons are everywhere. And then you've got Central African Republic, South Sudan, Uganda, Burundi on your northern and eastern borders. All of these places have had pretty severe instability at one point or another. The Congolese state is not particularly strong, especially for things like border control. So it's be very hard to stop smuggling. There are already a lot of weapons in country. They're around. They've been around. They'll probably stay around. So anyone who's got enough money to get bullets basically is able to keep a militia going.
Sure. And what about the corruption situation? I know that corruption is a huge issue in the Congo, both on the state level and with businesses and all sorts. Is the current government doing anything better, would you say, to combat that? Because I know that it's been a long issue, right?
Yeah. So it's we're kind of in a wait and see period right now. So the old regime under Kabila, he left office in early January of this year, was kind of world renowned for corruption, billions of dollars that were embezzled and funneled offshore, tons and tons of property and mineral concessions throughout the country. But he left office, and now there is Felix Tshisekedi, who's the new president. And so people are kind of waiting with bated breath to see how much of a change Tshisekedi is. I mean, he came into office kind of in a pretty corrupt deal. And the allegation is basically that it's almost like a Putin-Medvedev sort of situation, where Tshisekedi is kind of the face of the presidency and is promising this, that, and the other thing, but really Kabila is still the power behind the throne. So how much Tshisekedi is actually able to deal with things like corruption, we'll have to see, because he's going to be running up against the full machinery of the state that has been built on all of this stuff, especially the security forces. So they're making the right noises, but how much he's actually going to be able to do, and how much he actually wants to do, we'll see.
And how much influence does the West have in Congo in terms of, you've mentioned UNESCO and a few other institutions. How much influence do they actually have?
Well, there's a huge kind of UN presence, both humanitarian aid as well as peacekeepers. But they have to be neutral. They can't really take sides on a lot of this stuff. The U.S. for a long time had a lot of influence over Kinshasa, but I think with the election issue and Kabila refusing to step down, he kind of said screw off in a little bit of way. He wanted to stay in power. The U.S. told him not, and he said, well, what are you going to do about it? And they didn't do anything about it. So now that Tshisekedi's in, he's definitely trying to reestablish that relationship a bit more. And this is where it was kind of interesting. He was in Washington a month ago and was calling for a strategic partnership with the United States for a variety of economic and political issues, but specifically asked to join the coalition against the Islamic State. Now that the ADF is officially a franchise. So I think a big part of that is that he's, the United States recognized him as president, even though everybody kind of knew that the election was not on, and then sanctioned a bunch of the electoral officials who declared him president for violating all these rules about the election. So now he's in DC kind of saying, okay, well, I'm president now, let's kind of get back to work. I can be a counterterrorism partner. So we'll see how much the U.S. wants to do with that. I mean, I don't think Congo is particularly high on the menu for the Trump administration.
I don't think it's really high on the menu for anyone. It's unfortunate, I've read, I did a bit of research because I wanted to do some stories there in the Congo, and I don't know I don't know. It just seems like no one. It's like, oh, the Congo's fucked, whatever, more of the same. But really, there are, like we've said, thousands, millions of people displaced and being killed, and it just doesn't seem to stop. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think there's not quite the same degree of social media penetration that there is for some of the other conflicts around the world, and it's been going on for 25 years. So I think a lot of people have just kind of write it off as, oh, that's just, the thing that happens there, rather than, kind of understanding it as being this like long-standing ongoing crisis. But yeah, that attention is definitely, disproportionate in a bad way.
Absolutely. I think we'll wrap it up there, but before we do, are there any groups that you want to speak about that are, particularly trying to do things properly and, make things right in the Congo, or at least trying to help?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of different international organizations working in the East that have done some, phenomenal human rights work, poverty reduction, health, huge work on kind of the endemic of sexual violence throughout the East. There's a huge kind of activist movement for the East as well. We're just people who are kind of reporting on what's going on and trying to hold people accountable through kind of the public sphere, through social media, through kind of citizen journalists. There's tons of different media outlets. It's definitely one of those situations where, it's not that no news is being produced. It's that a lot of news is being and analysis and current events and all these things that are going are being produced by locals and really not getting out into the wider international audience. For people who are interested in this, like, there are tons and tons of resources if people want to kind of understand what's going on, understand who the players are, get involved with a variety of international or Congolese organizations. There's a huge amount of civil society that's in the East that really definitely deserves to be more at the forefront of people's conversations than just guys with guns and ISIS and Congo and conflict minerals.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think what it is people think, oh, well, the conflict's been going on so long there, and they sometimes have this idea as if the people are just kind of wallowing. It's like, no, absolutely not. The Congolese are, like you said, they're definitely trying to change things. Not everybody is a militant, not at all. And unfortunately, I don't know, man, it just gets ignored. I guess people would rather, cry about social media and stuff like that. But it is a shame. Ryan, is there anything else you want to say before we wrap this up?
I mean, I think for me, what's been kind of most illuminating about Congo is that these situations like this where a government collapses and then there's these huge vacuums of power that are filled by all of these kind of non-state groups, foreign actors and everything. It creates this kind of super messy situation that's really, really intractable. But I think that this is in a lot of ways quite similar to a lot of other conflicts around the world. I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels for a place like Syria. And I think that type of civil conflict is something that people are really going to need to have a better conception of going forward. And so I think people definitely, people who watch these sorts of conflicts need to be on the lookout to look at a whole bunch of different examples to really understand how these sorts of things play out and how we might move forward and get things to a better place.
Absolutely. And Ryan, if people want to follow your work on the Congo and the various other conflicts that you cover, where can they do that? Yeah,
for sure. So I think Twitter is probably the main thing. So it's at Ryan M. O'Farrell on Twitter, all lowercase, no apostrophe. Follow me on there. It's mostly serious stuff, but Congo, other places as well.
Cool, man. That was Ryan O'Farrell talking about the various splintered conflicts in the Congo, something you rarely hear about in the news, despite it flaring up there quite badly. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. You get bonus episodes, premium episodes, some might say. Patreon.com/popularfront. Go there for all sorts of extras for basically the price of one basic coffee a month. It's not a lot and it helps us keep going. If you don't like Patreon, which is completely understandable, you can go to popularfront.co/support. There are other ways there that you can, keep this all going. It is 100% grassroots, independent conflict journalism, so that's how we keep going. If you want to subscribe to us on YouTube, there are documentaries there. Go to youtube.com/popularfront, hit subscribe and hit the bell thing as well. We've got a bit of problem with YouTube still, constantly censoring the content, but whatever, can't really do much about it. So if you go on there, subscribe, you'll find it eventually. If you go to the shop, we've got loads more on sale there. So go to popularfront.bigcartel.com. 100% restock of all t-shirts and all sizes, and also the cease and desist bootleg champion collaboration jumper. So yeah, have a look at that before it gets taken down. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can follow me. That's twitter.com/Jake_Hanrahan. HANRAHAN is my surname. Or follow the Twitter, the Popular Front Twitter. That's twitter.com/popularfrontco. Same as the website, popularfront.co. There are articles, all the podcast episodes in order, ways to support, videos, everything is there. Contact, all of that stuff. Also on Instagram, we're instagram.com/popular.front. And thank you very much to the following people on the Patreon. As I always say, without you, this would absolutely crumble very fast. They are Adam Berg-Snyder, Andrew Fife, Axel Iverson, Brian McLaughlin, Callum Ross, Chad Walker, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Darby, Diana Gorvanek, Elizabeth Benicki, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Jack Mayhoff, James from the Discord, Joanne Stocker, Joel Tambusi, Kyle N. Payne, Lawrence Abrahams, LH, Margaret Bowling, Michael Euler, Noah, Ari, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormack from What Bitcoin Did, Q-Ball, Russia Alakidi, Ryan Sandercock, Scartoon Music, Scott Jonesy, Sebastian from the Discord, Surushe Hawazi, Stephen Davila, Teddy, Tom Lochrin, Tony Bin, Vida Provost and Zachary Hinch. Thank you very much. Like I said, if you want to support, get the premium episodes, access to the Discord, audio, articles, all sorts of stuff, go to patreon.com/popularfront. Music in this episode, the intro was by an artist called Home, and the outro was by vaporwave artist Windows 96. Check their music out at windows96.bandcamp.com.